The night Vivienne went into labor early, her husband's phone was off. Not dead, not on silent, off, completely, deliberately off. She found out later, much later, that he had been at a ski chalet in Mont-Tremblant with a woman named Brooke, a junior associate at his firm who wore her ambition the same way she wore her perfume. Impossible to ignore in a closed room. Vivienne was 31 years old, 36 weeks pregnant, standing alone in the bathroom of their Westmount townhouse at 2 in the morning, with her hands braced against the sink and contractions coming every 8 minutes, and her husband was an hour and a half north of Montreal with no intention of being found. She called her brother first, then the cab. Then she stopped trying to reach Marcus altogether, because the pain made it hard to think, and the thinking made it hard to breathe. And somewhere between the bathroom and the front door, she made a decision that she didn't fully understand yet. That she was going to get through this night on her own, and she was going to remember every detail of it. Vivienne had met Marcus Holt at a fundraising gala for the Sick Kids Foundation 4 years earlier. He was tall, composed, the kind of man who looked comfortable in a tuxedo because he'd been wearing them since boarding school. He was a corporate litigator at one of the big Bay Street firms. His family had money, old Quebec money, the kind that didn't announce itself. She was a pediatric occupational therapist from Gatineau, the first in her family to finish university, and she thought the way he looked at her across the table that night meant something honest. They were married 18 months later in a small ceremony in the Laurentians. Her father, a retired electrician named Gilbert, walked her down the aisle on a September afternoon when the maples were just starting to turn. He shook Marcus's hand for a long time at the altar, the kind of handshake that means something without words being exchanged. Gilbert had grown up in a town where a man's word was the whole of him. He believed Marcus. So did Vivienne. She should have paid attention to the first year. The late nights that turned into weekends away. The way Marcus flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever she mentioned coming to his firm's events. She filed these things away, and told herself they were the texture of a busy life, the friction of two careers finding their rhythm. When she got pregnant, she felt something settle in her chest. A certainty that they were building towards something solid. The contractions started on a Thursday night in February. The temperature outside was -22. She had been on modified bed rest for 2 weeks because her blood pressure had been creeping upward, and her obstetrician, Dr. Pelletier, had made very clear that if anything changed, Vivienne was to call immediately. Nothing about that night felt like an emergency at first. Just pressure, then sharpening pressure, then the specific, undeniable certainty of early labor. She tried Marcus's cell 11 times. She knew the number exactly because she counted them later, sitting in the hospital, because counting felt like something to do with her hands when the rest of her was falling apart. Her brother Felix arrived at the townhouse in 17 minutes. He was 26 and worked in construction and drove too fast, and when he came through the door and saw her face, he didn't say a single word, just picked up her hospital bag from beside the door, where she'd packed it 2 weeks earlier, and put his arm around her shoulders and walked her to his truck. She would think about that moment for years afterward. The silence of it. The steadiness. Their daughter was born at 4:47 in the morning, 6 weeks early, weighing 2 kilograms and 14 grams. The nurses put her immediately under the warming lights, and there was a stretch of several minutes. Long, gray, terrible minutes. When no one told Vivienne anything, when the room was full of efficient movement and clipped clinical language, and Felix held her hand so hard she felt her knuckles pressed together. Then one of the nurses turned and said, "She's breathing on her own, she's doing well," and Vivienne cried in a way she had never cried before, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than grief, from the place where relief and terror live together. She named the baby Margot. Marcus arrived at the hospital at 11:37 that morning. Vivienne knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the wall of the NICU. Margot was in an incubator, warm and monitored, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steadiness that Vivienne found almost unbearable in its preciousness. When Marcus appeared in the doorway, he was still wearing the clothes from the night before. His hair was not quite right. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed something in the car. He said he was so sorry. He said his phone had died. He said he had driven back the moment he woke up and realized something was wrong. His phone had died. Vivienne looked at him across the incubator where their daughter was sleeping with a feeding tube taped gently to her cheek, and she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say. Because she understood with a clarity that felt almost chemical, that nothing she said in that room would be the truth of what needed to be said. That conversation belonged somewhere else. Later, Felix was not in the room. He had gone down to the cafeteria, and Vivienne was glad for it, because she didn't trust what would happen if her brother and her husband were in the same space with that particular silence between them. She found out about Brooke on a Tuesday 3 weeks after Margot came home. Margot was still on a monitor at night. A small device that tracked her oxygen and her heartbeat and beeped when something needed attention. Vivian was sleeping in fragments, waking at every small sound, learning the geography of her daughter's breath the way you learn a new language, by immersion, by repetition, by necessity. She wasn't looking for anything. That's the part she would always find strange. She wasn't suspicious in the way that leads you to go searching. She was just exhausted, and she had picked up Marcus's jacket from the chair to hang it up, and the phone had slipped out of the pocket, and the screen had lit with a message preview from a contact saved as B3 words. She read them before she could stop herself. She sat down on the bedroom floor. She sat there for a long time. Marcus was in the kitchen. She could hear him on a work call, his voice doing the particular thing it did in professional settings, measured, authoritative, slightly warmer than his natural register. The baby monitor on the dresser gave off its quiet, constant static. Outside the window a snowplow was working its way up the street. All of it was completely ordinary. All of it was happening in a world that had just become unrecognizable. She didn't confront him that night. She waited until Margot was asleep, and Felix had come over under the pretense of fixing a pipe under the kitchen sink. A pretense Vivienne had arranged, because she needed someone in the building, someone who didn't know why yet. She put the phone on the kitchen table and she told Marcus what she had read, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when a person realizes the particular story they have been living inside has just ended. He didn't deny it. To his credit, the only credit she would ever give him for any of this. He didn't try to construct another lie on top of the one that was already collapsing. He said it had been going on for 8 months. He said it wasn't serious. A phrase that Vivienne would later identify as the most revealing thing he had ever said. Because it told her everything about how he understood the weight of what he had done. 8 months. Their daughter had been conceived inside those 8 months. Vivienne had been to every prenatal appointment alone, or with her mother, or with Felix. She had been on bed rest with elevated blood pressure that her doctor said was likely stress-related. She had labored alone in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, while her husband was an hour and a half away with his phone switched off. Not serious. Felix left the room. Vivienne heard his boots in the hallway, the door to the back porch, and then nothing. She called her father the next morning. Gilbert Tremblay was 64 years old. He had worked his whole adult life with his hands, decades of electrical work in the Ottawa Valley, wiring houses and schools and the hospital where Vivienne herself had been born. He had a reputation in his community as a man who showed up when he was needed and said exactly what he meant and did not engage in performance. When Vivienne's mother had died 7 years ago, he had quietly, methodically, with no announcement, cooked dinner every Sunday for his 2 children, until they told him he didn't need to anymore. He was not a man who expressed love loudly. He was a man who expressed love reliably. When Vivienne called him that morning, she told him everything. She told him about the night of Margot's birth, about the phone being off, about Brooke, about the 8 months, about the 3 words on the screen. She told him about bed rest and blood pressure and 36 weeks. She cried through most of it and her father listened through all of it without interrupting. When she finished there was a silence. Then Gilbert said, "I'll be there Thursday." He drove 4 hours from his house outside Renfrew, and arrived on Thursday afternoon with a bag of groceries and no stated agenda. He spent the first evening doing exactly what he always did, holding Margot, feeding her when Vivienne needed to sleep, washing dishes without being asked. He and Marcus did not speak beyond what was necessary. Marcus had moved to the guest room by then, and the house had taken on the particular atmosphere of a place where something has broken and no one has agreed yet about whether it can be fixed. On Friday morning, Gilbert asked Marcus to take a walk with him. Marcus agreed. Vivienne watched them leave from the kitchen window. She did not know what her father said during that walk. She never asked and Gilbert never offered. What she knew was that they walked for nearly an hour in the February cold, and when they came back Marcus's face looked different. Not broken exactly, but rearranged, like a room after furniture has been moved and before it's been decided where anything will go. Gilbert stayed for 9 days. During those 9 days he made several calls. Gilbert had spent 40 years in skilled trades, and in that world, certain names carry weight in certain rooms. He knew a man who sat on the board of Marcus's firm's largest institutional client. Not a friend exactly, more the kind of acquaintance that a life of reliable unglamorous work occasionally produces. He made that call on a Saturday afternoon from the back porch, in a voice so quiet Vivienne could only hear the murmur of it through the window. He also called a lawyer, not for Vivienne initially. She had her own, a woman named Dufresne from a firm in the Plateau who was direct and systematic and wore reading glasses on a chain and treated Vivienne's case with a focus that felt close to personal. Gilbert called a different lawyer, an old contact who handled employment and professional conduct matters, and they had a long conversation about the ethics provisions in the Law Society of Ontario's rules governing conduct with junior associates, specifically the power dynamics involved when a senior partner at a firm pursues a relationship with an associate over whom he holds direct supervisory authority. Brooke was not, as it turned out, a willing equal participant in the way that Marcus had presented her. This became clear over the following weeks as the fuller picture emerged. She had been a second-year associate, trying to make partner, working under Marcus's direct supervision. She had felt, in her own words communicated later through her own lawyer, that she had not been in a position to refuse. She was not the villain of this story. She was another person Marcus had damaged in a different way, and Vivienne eventually arrived at a complicated imperfect peace with that understanding. One that didn't excuse Brooke entirely but also didn't flatten her into something simple. Marcus's firm opened a conduct review in April. The process was not public, but its consequences were. By June he had been asked to step down from his partnership track. His equity stake was restructured. He remained at the firm in a reduced capacity for another 8 months, and then quietly departed for a smaller practice in another city, the way certain careers end. Not with announcement, but with the slow draining away of the things that had made the position worth having. The divorce was finalized 14 months after Margot's birth. Vivienne kept the Westmount townhouse. The settlement included full joint decision-making on major matters but primary residence with Vivienne, child support, and a clause that Vivienne's lawyer had insisted upon and that Marcus, perhaps understanding that he was not in a position to contest anything, had signed without argument. She did not feel triumphant when the papers were signed. She didn't think she would, but she'd half expected something. Some lightening, some arrival of clarity. What she felt instead was tired and sad and quietly certain that she had done the right thing, which is its own kind of feeling, less like victory and more like ground. Marcus sent an email 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. It was 3 paragraphs long. He said he understood what he had taken from her and from Margot that night in February, that he had thought about it every day since. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it. He said he hoped Margot would know, when she was old enough to understand anything, that he had not been worth the man who walked beside her mother at her wedding, and he was sorry to have wasted that. Vivienne read it twice. Then she had closed her laptop and went to get Margot from her afternoon nap. Her daughter was 11 months old by then. She was not small anymore. She had caught up quickly. The NICU nurses had told Vivienne she would, and they had been right. She was sturdy and loud and had inherited her grandfather's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that in the right light looked almost gold. When Vivienne walked into the room, Margot was standing at the rail of her crib, holding on with both hands, watching the door with an expression of total concentration. When she saw Vivienne, she let go of the rail. Just for a second, testing something. Gilbert came back every month. He always called first and asked if it was a good time, and Vivienne always said yes, and he always brought groceries and stayed for 3 or 4 days and cooked Sunday dinner, and took Margot out in the stroller so Vivienne could sleep. He never talked about what he had said to Marcus on that February walk. He didn't need to. What he had done was already visible in the shape the aftermath had taken, in the firmness of the settlement, in the conduct review, in the quiet thorough way the life Marcus had built on a foundation of convenient dishonesty had been invited to account for itself. Not by rage, by a man who knew which calls to make and made them methodically, without spectacle, the same way he had always done everything worth doing. One evening in late autumn, when the light was going golden and early and Margot was asleep, and Gilbert was sitting across the kitchen table from his daughter with 2 cups of tea between them, Vivienne asked him what he had said to Marcus on the walk. He picked up his cup, thought about it. I told him that a man who switches off his phone when his wife is 36 weeks pregnant has already made a choice, he said. And that the rest of what happened was just the world catching up to that choice. He put the cup down. I also told him I knew people, he said, and smiled in the way that was barely a smile, the way he always had when something serious had been said as simply as possible. And that I was going to make sure the people I knew. Vivienne wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside the maples were losing the last of their leaves onto the sidewalk below, and the street was quiet, and somewhere down the hall Margot was sleeping through the night for the 3rd time that week, getting stronger by the day. As if she had understood from the very first hours of her life, that the world she'd arrived in a little too early, was still worth showing up for.